Welcome back. We've been looking at creating user interfaces in Unity, and in this video we're going to look at adding some interactivity. In other words, we're going to make user interface elements respond to clicks and other kinds of user interaction. So here we have these two buttons, which let me start and stop the rotation of this cube. And this other UI element up here, a slider, which lets me adjust the speed of rotation. So these UI elements all belong to this canvas object over here. But the interactive behavior is actually enabled by this event system object. When we add the canvas to the scene, Unity is going to automatically add this event system. And there's only ever one event system per scene, even if we have multiple canvases. So an event system has two components which we need to understand. The first is this event system component and this input module. So the event system has overall responsibility for interface events and things like what object is currently selected. And the input module basically translates inputs to the game into UI input events. So let's first take a look at this event system. So at the bottom of the inspector here, you can see there's some debug information which tells us what's currently happening in the event system. So for example, which user interface element is currently selected. It's the play button right now. If I pause, I can see that that's now changed to the pause button being selected. We also have a number of things we can configure in the component itself. So we have this script, which is a reference to the event system script. That's just engine code for handling events. You don't ever need to modify that. We have this first selected option here. We can say that when the scene starts, we want a particular UI element to be selected. In this case, it's nothing. So when we start the scene, we're just going to wait for the user to select something. We also have send navigation events. This basically chooses whether we let the user navigate the interface using arrow keys or similar inputs. So this is enabled, so I should be able to navigate it. So if I click over here on play, then I can actually, you can't see me doing this, but I'm using the arrow keys to toggle back and forth between the play and pause button. If you look at the bottom of the inspector, you can see that the currently selected UI element is actually changing. There's no visual difference in this example, but for example, if I'm on the pause button, I should be able to stop it by pressing space. Yeah. Right. Let's go back to the play button and start it again. So that's navigation events. You can turn those off so the user can't use arrow keys and the like to navigate around. We also have this drag threshold here, which is set to 10 by default. So that defines how much you can move your mouse before a click input becomes a drag input. So typically you want a little bit of error on that, because when people click things, they don't keep their mouse or their finger on a touchscreen perfectly still. There might be a little bit of wobble, so you want to say how much wobble you have before a drag event is triggered. The other component on the event system is this input module here, which configures how the various inputs to the game which Unity recognizes are going to be translated into user interface inputs. So we can see here, for example, that a submit input to the game is going to be interpreted as a submit button input to the interface. Not particularly insightful, but you can actually find out what these mean by going up here to the edit menu, selecting project settings, and looking at the input manager. So the input manager defines various input axes which Unity are going to recognize. Now we can scroll down here to see that submit is a particular axis being defined. In this case, it means that if a positive input is pressing the return button, or alternatively button 0 on a joystick. In fact, there's a couple of submit axes. So we've got another one here, which again just says, well, also you can say a submit is the enter key, or alternatively the space key. So all of those inputs register as a submit input. So you can go into the input manager and redefine how these things work. Normally you won't need to change these, you can just use the standard input axes. So that's all there is to the event system object really. It's very useful for debugging interfaces. We have this information down here which helps us with that. But once we've set it up, we can usually ignore it. And we do actually most of the work of configuring interactivity on the individual UI elements like the buttons and the sliders. So let's take a look at that. Here's the UI canvas. You can see it here in the object hierarchy. And the various UI elements that we have on the canvas appear as descendants in the hierarchy. So we've got a couple of buttons, play and pause, and we have the slider as well. And you can also see that the buttons have as child objects these image UI elements, which are the play and pause icons, which appear on the buttons. So as we saw before, it's really easy to add things like buttons and text and images to the canvas. We can just go to Game Object, the UI menu, and it gives us various options. So the slider, for example, I've just added by selecting slider here. And you can see that the slider is actually quite a complex object, which has various parts to it. We're going to ignore that for now. Let's take a closer look at one of the buttons. So let's click that play button. So what we have in the inspector, as I would expect, is a rect transform. We also have this canvas render, which we can ignore for now, and this other two components, an image and a button component. So the image is this nice big yellow sprite, which I got for free off the asset store. We can ignore that for now. What we're really interested in here is this button. Right, so this component is the thing which actually adds the interactive behavior that we want to this button. So there's quite a few things going on this button component. So let's break it down, take a look at them one by one. So to start off, we've got this interactable flag. So we can toggle this. If we turn it off, then that disables this button. We might want to disable UI elements because we don't want them active in certain parts of the menu. Would probably do that from a script that reacts to a particular context in the game. We then have this larger section here called transition elements. Basically, this defines what happens. The graphical changes that happen to the button when it's interacted with. So here we've got a color tint change. You might not really be able to see it very well, but there's a slightly different color tint which is applied when the button is pressed or if it's disabled. And we could also choose to, for example, change the sprite on the button when it's interacted with or play an animation. Down here we've got this navigation section. So if you remember, navigation events let the user navigate around the interface using arrow keys, etc., spacebar to select, that kind of thing. And we can actually define custom behavior here on how we want the user to be able to navigate from this play button to other UI elements. So actually we can click on visualize here to see how this is set up. So you can see that the left, right, up, down behavior is defined between these various UI elements. And we can change that here. The moment it's automatically set up, so we don't need to worry about it. Unity just kind of decides based on the spatial layout how you might move between them, but we might have a particular view on that. We can perhaps turn it off and allow no navigation from this play button at all, or we could set it explicitly and say, well, if you press up, where do you go? If you press down, where do you go? Okay, let's turn that off. Actually back to automatic for now. And finally, at the bottom of the button component, we have this section here where we can actually define what the button does when you press it. So each UI element is going to respond to certain UI events. Here, this button can respond to on-click events. So when we click it, an on-click event is fired. And this basically defines how we're going to handle these. So we've got one particular handler here. We could define multiple handlers. If I press plus here, I could add another one and perhaps do two different things when the button is pressed, but we've just got one here for now. We've got this little option here, either turning the handler off, saying it's runtime only, or what we usually want is we want to test the interface in the editor. So we'll have editor and runtime selected, which means when I play it in editor, it's actually going to be clickable. All right, so we want to say a couple of things. First of all, we want to tell Unity, well, what is going to handle this event? So that's going to be a game object and specifically a component of a game object. So here I've said it's the cube that's going to handle this event. So when we click one of these buttons, click this play button, we want the cube to change its behavior. So I can actually say it's the cube which is going to handle this click event. And then when that's selected, now we can perhaps go and change it to something else, but we've got the cube there. We now get a list of options here, which basically say all the different ways in which the cube could potentially respond to this click when we send it this event. So let's actually move the window over here a bit so you can see these options more clearly. So if I click on that, we can see what's listed down here are the various components which are on that cube. So we know the cube is a game object, it has a transform, it also has a mesh filter and renderer, it's got a collider on it, and it's got this thing called a cube controller. That's just a script which I've written actually to handle the click events. And on each of these components, there are various public methods defined, which could be the method that we want to use to respond to this click. So for example, on the transform, we have a lookat method. That lookat method, if you remember from a few lectures ago, is going to rotate that game object so it's looking at a particular transform in the scene. So we could choose that when this play button is clicked, the cube is going to look at some other position. That's not what we want here. What we want to do is start the cube rotating. So I'm going to go to the script which I've written called cube controller and find the public method. So here we can see that I've got a rotate start method already selected. So that's the thing that's going to be called when this button is clicked. So our cube controller script is quite simple, really. It's got this public integer, which is speed, and we have a flag rotate, which tells us whether the cube is rotating or not. So we start off not rotating, and at every frame we just check to see if we are rotating. If we are, we do a little bit of rotation. And then we've got these public methods. These are the things which are going to be used to handle these click events, right? So we've got rotate start, which turns rotation on, rotate stop, turns it off. And for the slider, we can actually take a float and set the speed to be an integer based on that float. So looking at the pause button here, we can see that the main difference with play button is that instead of calling cube controller rotate start, it calls cube controller rotate stop, which we just saw. If we look at the slider, it's slightly more complicated, but similar in many ways. So we've got the interactable toggle here. We've got some transition graphical effects which are going to be applied. We've got the navigation section. We just have a couple of other things here. We've got this fill and handle rect. So there's kind of multiple parts to this slider. So the fill is basically this bit that goes from the minimum value to where the handle is. And then this handle rect is a bit that goes from this to the maximum value. So we might want, for example, have a bar here that we're actually dragging up and down, in which case we could change these rects to actually get that effect. We've got a direction going from left to right. We've got a minimum and maximum value. This takes this from 0 to 500 and an initial value. So the slider is slightly different to the buttons in that we actually want to have this value selected and then passed to the set speed public method in our cube controller script. So when we choose the method that's going to handle this event, we can actually see which methods are going to accept parameters that the slider can provide. So let's move the window again over here so you can see the options. So if we have a look at the cube controller select speed here, we can see it's actually identified here in a special area where it says dynamic float. Basically, because the slider element is going to provide this float value, then it knows it's looking for public methods which are going to accept the float as a parameter. And it's identified set speed as being one of those, so we can select that. And there's other methods we could choose to use, but they're not going to have that float value passed to them. Finally, I want to show you how you can make any user interface element respond to different events which might be triggered by the event system. So if we look at this play image here, this is the little play black image here, which is on the play button. Right now, it's not interactive, right? So the interactivity of the play button is actually handled by its parent, the play button up here. The image is just an image. But we could choose, say, to take any image like this and make it interactive by adding another component. And we can add this event trigger, which basically gives us similar kind of options that we saw on the button and the slider, but something we can completely customize ourselves. So we can add a new event type, and it gives us a whole list of different kinds of things that this image might want to respond to. So for example, whether it's dragged, or whether it's a scroll, or clicking with a pointer, that kind of thing. Let's make it responsive to clicks. And we get the similar kind of list of event handlers that we can configure ourselves. So add one of here, we get exactly the same functionality we had on the button. So this allows us to put things like images, text, or other interface elements which aren't usually interactive and add interactivity to them. So that's how the event system makes the UI responsive to user input. Thanks very much for listening.